Welcome back to Mildly Interesting and Sleepy. The hour is late, the world outside is quiet, and that is exactly right. This is the time for the kind of thinking that goes slowly, that covers wide ground without rushing, that allows ideas to settle into place before moving on to the next one. Tonight we are spending time with one of the most astonishing minds in human history, Aristotle. Born in 384 before the Common Era in a small Greek city on the northern Aegean coast, who studied at Plato's academy for 20 years, who tutored the boy who grew up to conquer the known world, and who spent his working life writing about every subject that the 4th century before the Common Era recognized as worth thinking about seriously. Philosophy, biology, physics, psychology, ethics, politics, rhetoric, poetics, logic, astronomy, meteorology, the nature of the soul, the nature of God, the nature of memory and sleep and dreams, the nature of friendship, the structure of tragedy, the conditions of stable government. Aristotle wrote about all of it. The surviving corpus runs to roughly 2,000 pages in modern editions, and that represents a fraction of what he actually wrote. The lost works, the polished dialogues, and the popular treatises that ancient readers admired probably exceeded what survives. He is, by most historical reckoning, the most influential thinker in Western history, not because everything he said was right. Much of it was wrong. Some of it was spectacularly wrong in ways that held back the development of science for nearly 2,000 years. But because the framework he built, the concepts he invented, the questions he systematically posed and answered, shaped how educated people in the Western world organized their thinking about virtually every subject from his own time through the Renaissance. Even after the scientific revolution overturned most of his specific claims, the conceptual vocabulary he created remained embedded in intellectual life so deeply that we are still working our way out of it in some domains and still working with it gratefully in others. Let us begin. The life, Stagira, Athens, Macedonia, and the Lyceum. Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era in Stagira, a small Greek colony on the Chalcidic Peninsula in what is now northern Greece, about 60 miles east of Thessaloniki. The city was not Athens. It was not one of the great centers of Greek cultural life. It was a provincial place, which may be part of why Aristotle's relationship to Athens always retained something of the perspective of an outsider looking in, someone who could see the city's assumptions clearly because they were not entirely his own. His father Nicomachus was the personal physician to Amyntas III, the king of Macedon, and this connection to the Macedonian royal house was not incidental to Aristotle's life. It is what eventually brought him back to Macedonia to tutor Amyntas's grandson, the boy who would become Alexander the Great. Medicine was a skilled and respected profession, and it brought with it a tradition of careful observation of the natural world, of attention to the particular and the functional, that Aristotle would carry into his philosophy in ways that distinguished his approach from Plato's. His father died when Aristotle was young, probably around 10 years old, and he was raised by a guardian named Proxenus, who sent him to Athens at the age of 17 to study at Plato's academy. This was where the serious philosophical and mathematical work was being done. Aristotle arrived in Athens around 367 and stayed for 20 years until Plato died in 347. 20 years is a long time, and Aristotle was not a passive student for any of it. He was engaging with Plato's ideas from early on, absorbing them, developing his own responses, writing. By the time he left, he was not a student who had completed a program, but a mature and independent thinker who had developed his philosophical positions in sustained conversation with the Platonic tradition. When Plato died, Aristotle left Athens. He went to Assos in Asia Minor, where a former member of the academy named Hermias had become the ruler of a small territory. Hermias was philosophically inclined, genuinely interested in the intellectual work being done at the academy, and he welcomed Aristotle warmly. Aristotle spent 3 productive years at Assos, doing philosophical work and beginning or continuing the biological research that would become one of his greatest achievements. He married Pythias, a niece of Hermias, and they had a daughter. Hermias was eventually captured and tortured to death by Persian agents who wanted to know about his dealings with Philip of Macedon. Aristotle later wrote a hymn to Hermias, a formal encomium of the kind normally reserved for gods and heroes, which was unusual and which gives some indication of what the relationship had meant. After Assos, Aristotle moved to the island of Lesbos, where he spent perhaps 2 years doing some of his most important biological research in the lagoons and coastal waters around the city of Mytilene. The biological environment of Lesbos was extraordinarily rich, and the investigations he conducted there of marine animals, of embryological development, of the anatomical structures of creatures that had never been systematically described before, produced observations that would not be equaled by any systematic investigator for nearly 2,000 years. Then came the invitation from Philip II of Macedon, the most powerful ruler in the Greek world, to tutor his 13-year-old son Alexander. Aristotle went, around 343. He spent several years at the Macedonian court as the prince's teacher. Alexander was educated by Aristotle in literature, philosophy, medicine, and natural science, and he apparently absorbed something from each domain. He reportedly slept with an annotated copy of the Iliad under his pillow. He sent biological specimens back from his conquests in Asia. He founded cities named Alexandria, and at least one that he named after his horse. Whether any of Aristotle's political philosophy shaped how Alexander governed his empire is much more doubtful. Alexander's empire was not organized on Aristotelian principles of the moderate city-state. In 335, with Alexander now king and the political situation in Greece reordered around Macedonian power, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded his own school. He was 50 years old and at the peak of his powers. The school was located in a park and gymnasium outside the city walls, sacred to the god Apollo Lyceus, which gave the school its name, the Lyceum. The walking paths of the park gave the school its other name, the peripatetic school, from peripatein, to walkabout, either because Aristotle taught while walking or because the covered walkways of the gymnasium were used for philosophical discussion. The 13 years at the Lyceum were his most productive. The surviving corpus of Aristotle's work was largely composed or organized into its final form during this period. The school attracted students from across the Greek world, conducted research in philosophy, biology, history, political science, and related subjects, and accumulated a substantial library, one of the first great institutional libraries in the ancient world. Alexander reportedly sent funds to support the research. When Alexander died in 323, the political atmosphere in Athens changed quickly and dangerously for anyone associated with the Macedonian court. A charge of impiety was brought against Aristotle. He left Athens, reportedly saying he would not give Athens the opportunity to sin against philosophy a second time, a pointed reference to the execution of Socrates. He went to Chalcis in Euboea, where his mother's family had property. He died there the following year, in 322, of a disease of the stomach or intestines. He was 62 years old. His will, which survives and which scholars have praised as thoughtful and humane, provided for his household and his children, arranged for the freedom of some of his slaves, and specified that his wife Pythias's bones should be placed in his grave as she had wished. The surviving works, lecture notes and lost dialogues. Before engaging with what Aristotle thought, there is an important fact about the surviving texts that shapes everything we can say. The works we have are almost certainly not the works Aristotle considered his literary best, and they are probably not the works his contemporaries most admired. Aristotle wrote dialogues in the Platonic style, philosophical conversations in dramatic form, intended for general audiences. Ancient readers who had access to them praised them warmly. Cicero said they had golden rivers of speech, that their style was a kind of eloquence both copious and refined. None of these dialogues survive except for fragments quoted by later authors who happened to mention them. He wrote other popular works on various subjects. Most of those are lost too. What survives appears to be lecture notes, working drafts, and teaching materials. Texts intended for use within the school, for an audience already engaged in philosophical conversation, not for the general, educated public. They read like what they probably are: dense, compressed, sometimes elliptical, occasionally contradictory, because different passages were written at different times, and the revisions were not always harmonized. They are not polished literary achievements. They are the working papers of an extraordinarily productive mind. This matters because reading Aristotle requires a different kind of patience and attention than reading Plato. Where Plato's dialogues draw you in with drama and character and literary beauty, Aristotle's treatises demand that you follow a very fast mind that is not always pausing to explain its shortcuts or to acknowledge when it is making a significant transition. The reward for this patience is access to one of the most powerful and comprehensive intellectual systems ever constructed. But the patience is genuinely required. What we have is enormous in scope. The organon, the logical works, the physics on the heavens, on generation and corruption, meteorologica, natural philosophy, on the soul and related psychological works, the history of animals, parts of animals, generation of animals, biology, the metaphysics, the Nicomachean ethics and Eudemian ethics, the politics, the rhetoric, the poetics. Each of these is a substantial work that founded or significantly shaped its field. Together, they constitute an intellectual achievement without parallel. Logic, inventing the science of valid reasoning. Before Aristotle, there was no science of logic. There was careful argument, there was mathematics, there was the Socratic practice of examining arguments for consistency and inconsistency. But there was no systematic theory of what makes an argument formally valid, no account of the structure of inference that was independent of the content of the argument. Aristotle invented this. The prior analytics, the central work of the organon, is the first systematic treatise on formal logic in the history of thought. The core of Aristotle's logic is the theory of the syllogism, a formal argument consisting of two premises and a conclusion, where the conclusion follows necessarily from the premises by virtue of their logical structure. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. The necessity of the conclusion does not depend on any empirical fact about Socrates or about mortality. It depends entirely on the logical form. If all things of kind A have property B and X is of kind A, then X has property B. This is always true, regardless of what you substitute for A, B, and X. Aristotle identified the valid forms of syllogistic inference with remarkable systematicity. He classified propositions into four types: universal affirmative, all A are B; universal negative, no A are B; particular affirmative, some A are B; particular negative, some A are not B. He worked out which combinations of two premises yield a valid conclusion and which do not, organizing the valid forms into three figures based on the arrangement of the terms. He distinguished valid from invalid arguments, identified common fallacies, and showed how seemingly valid arguments could go wrong. The technical details of syllogistic logic can feel dry, and in the hands of lesser minds, they did become very dry. Medieval scholastic logic devoted enormous energy to increasingly refined distinctions within the Aristotelian framework that struck many later observers as empty scholasticism. But the underlying achievement is genuine and significant. Aristotle identified the formal structure of valid inference as a subject of inquiry in its own right, demonstrated that validity was a matter of form rather than content, and created the first systematic tool for evaluating arguments independent of what the arguments were about. This was the foundation on which all subsequent logic was built, even though syllogistic itself was eventually superseded by the far more powerful modern predicate logic developed by Frege and Russell in the 19th and 20th centuries. Beyond the prior analytics, the organon includes the posterior analytics, which analyzes the nature of scientific knowledge and explanation, and argues that genuine scientific understanding requires demonstration from first principles. The topics, which analyzes dialectical reasoning from widely accepted premises. The sophistical refutations, which catalogues common logical fallacies. The categories, which analyzes the fundamental kinds of things that can be said about anything. And the deinterpretation, which analyzes the logical structure of sentences and the nature of truth and falsity. Together, these works gave Western intellectual culture a complete logical toolkit that served philosophy, theology, law, and science for centuries. Metaphysics, substance, form, matter, and the unmoved mover. The metaphysics begins with one of the most famous sentences in the history of philosophy. All human beings by nature desire to know. This sentence is both an empirical claim and a kind of manifesto. It says that curiosity is natural, that the desire to understand is not a distraction from human life, but one of its defining features, and that the investigation of ultimate reality is therefore not a luxury, but an expression of what we most fundamentally are. Aristotle called his investigation of the fundamental nature of reality first philosophy or theology. The word metaphysics came later, from the placement of these works after the physics in the standard edition of Aristotle's texts. First philosophy investigates being qua being considered simply as being, abstracted from all the particular ways in which specific things exist, asking what is most fundamental and universal about everything that exists. His central concept is substance, ousia in Greek, the basic units of reality, the primary things that exist. And here his deepest disagreement with Plato becomes clear. For Plato, the most real things were the forms, abstract universals existing in a separate realm. For Aristotle, the most real things are particular physical things. This horse, this man, this olive tree in this garden. Universals are real, but they do not exist separately from the particular things that instantiate them. They exist in the particular things as those things' natures or forms. Aristotle's answer to how to understand particular physical things is his doctrine of hylomorphism. Every physical thing is a compound of matter and form. Matter, hyle, is the material substrate, what something is made of. Form, morph, is the organizing principle, the structure or nature or essence that makes something the kind of thing it is. A bronze sphere is bronze organized into a spherical shape. A human being is physical material organized by the human soul, which Aristotle identifies as the form of a human body. The form is not a separate thing from the substance. It is the substance's way of being organized as the particular kind of thing it is. This hylomorphism is Aristotle's response to the Platonic theory of forms, and it is a response that preserves what Aristotle saw as the genuine insight in Plato's theory, while correcting what he saw as its central error. Aristotle agreed that universals were real and important, and that knowledge of them was the goal of inquiry. He disagreed that they existed separately from particular things. The form of man is not a perfect man in a separate realm. It is what is common to all actual men, present in each of them as their form. To understand what a man is, you do not look away from particular men toward a transcendent form. You look at particular men more carefully, more systematically, until you understand what they have in common and why. His theory of causation was another major contribution, the famous doctrine of the four causes. To fully understand any natural thing or any change, you need to identify four distinct explanatory factors. The material cause, what is it made of? The formal cause, what kind of thing is it? What is its essence or nature? The efficient cause, what brought it about? What agent or process produced it? The final cause, what is it for? What is its purpose or function or end? The final cause is the most distinctive and the most controversial element of Aristotle's causal framework. He was a thoroughgoing teleologist. He believed that natural things had inherent purposes, that the acorn was for the oak tree, that the eye was for seeing, that the heart was for circulating blood and maintaining life. These purposes were not imposed by a divine mind from outside nature, but were internal to natural things, part of what they were. The oak tree's nature is to grow from an acorn into a full oak and produce more acorns. This end is part of the oak's essence, and understanding oak trees requires understanding this end. Teleological thinking was rejected by the scientific revolution. Galileo and Newton built a science of matter and motion governed by mathematical laws in which there were no purposes in nature, only causes pushing from behind rather than ends drawing from in front. This rejection was enormously productive, giving us the physics and chemistry and engineering that constitute the modern technological world. But the rejection was not total or without cost. In biology, the concept of biological function continues to play an explanatory role that resists purely mechanistic analysis, and the philosophy of biology remains divided about how to understand teleological language in evolutionary contexts. Aristotle's basic insight that to understand living things you need to understand what they are for as well as what they are made of has not been entirely superseded. At the summit of Aristotle's metaphysics is the unmoved mover, his argument for a divine principle underlying the universe. Motion and change require explanation. Whatever is in motion was set in motion by something else, which was itself set in motion by something else. This chain of efficient causes cannot go back infinitely. There must be a first cause of motion that is not itself moved by anything prior. This is the unmoved mover, the prime mover, the first principle of the cosmos's activity. It is eternal, immaterial, perfectly actual, containing no potentiality and therefore no possibility of change. Its activity is pure thought thinking itself, intellectual self-contemplation of perfect adequacy. It causes motion not by pushing or pulling, but by being the ultimate object of the cosmos's aspiration, a final cause of everything that moves. The unmoved mover is not the personal God of the Abrahamic religions. It does not create the world from nothing, does not intervene in history, does not love human beings or respond to prayer, does not punish or reward. It is the ultimate principle of order and actuality in a universe that is itself eternal, without beginning or end. Medieval Christian and Islamic philosophers, nevertheless, identified it with the God of their traditions, with significant philosophical strain. Aquinas, in particular, devoted enormous energy to the reconciliation of Aristotelian theology with Christian doctrine. and the result, Thomism, remains the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. Biology, the greatest natural historian before Darwin. To understand what was most genuinely remarkable about Aristotle as a scientist and a thinker, you have to spend time with the biology, which is where his combination of patient empirical observation, systematic classification, and theoretical explanation oriented toward understanding causes and functions produced its most sustained and most impressive results. The biological works, history of animals, parts of animals, generation of animals, movement of animals, and a cluster of shorter related treatises represent the first systematic science of zoology in human history. They describe and analyze more than 500 species. They are based on direct observation, on dissection, on sustained attention to the behavior and reproduction and anatomy of living creatures, conducted over years and probably with the assistance of others who contributed observations from their own experience. Some of what Aristotle got right is extraordinary for the 4th century before the Common Era. He recognized that whales and dolphins were mammals, not fish. They breathed air, were warm-blooded, gave birth to live young and nursed them. This was a counterintuitive recognition that required careful attention to the evidence over the obvious category of appearance, and it would not be confirmed or widely accepted again until the modern period. He identified the distinction between what we now call vertebrates and invertebrates, using the presence or absence of blood as his criterion, and organized the animal kingdom into a hierarchical classification that anticipated in its broad structure the systematic taxonomy that Linnaeus would develop 2,000 years later. He described the placenta of the smooth dogfish, a cartilaginous fish, in a way that was not confirmed by later investigators until the 19th century. He understood the basic structure of the heart as the central organ of the circulatory system. He also got many things wrong, some of them surprising. He believed women had fewer teeth than men, which required only simple observation to falsify, and apparently did not receive it. He believed in spontaneous generation, the production of living things from non-living matter, and gave detailed accounts of how eels arose from mud and certain insects from dew or from the materials they happened to be associated with. He made various errors in anatomical description. He attributed intelligence to the heart rather than the brain, thinking the brain was a cooling organ for the blood. Charles Darwin, writing in 1882, after he had read Aristotle's biological works with the help of a translation provided by a student, wrote that Linnaeus and Cuvier had been his two gods, though in very different ways, but they were mere schoolboys compared to old Aristotle. This is not empty praise from a man who had no reason to flatter a long-dead competitor. It is the recognition, from the greatest natural historian of the modern era, that Aristotle had done something genuinely remarkable that had not been equaled for nearly 2,000 years. The biological method Aristotle employed is worth understanding because it differs importantly from his approach in physics. In physics, he relied too heavily on a priori reasoning about the natures of the elements, on what seemed fitting and natural rather than on careful measurement. In biology, he went and looked, repeatedly and carefully and over extended time, and he organized what he saw into a theoretical framework oriented toward understanding function and cause. Why does this animal have this structure? What does it serve? How does it relate to the animal's characteristic way of life? These are the questions that organized his biological inquiry, and they are recognizably the right questions, even if the specific answers were sometimes wrong. His approach to biology was teleological in a way that has been productive even for modern biology. Understanding an organism requires understanding what its parts are for, how they contribute to the organism's life and reproduction, how they are adapted to the organism's environment. The language of function and adaptation in modern biology is not identical to Aristotle's final cause, but it is not entirely different either. The debate in philosophy of biology about how to understand teleological language without a divine mind or an Aristotelian substantial form has been going on for decades and is not yet resolved. The soul as the form of the body. Aristotle's theory of the soul, developed primarily in the De Anima, on the soul, is one of his most important contributions to psychology and one of his sharpest and most consequential departures from Plato. For Plato, the soul was a separate non-physical substance imprisoned in the body, genuinely capable of existing without the body, pre-existing the body before birth and surviving it after death. The body was, in some sense, the soul's prison or its tomb, something the philosopher practiced detaching from during life in preparation for the soul's full liberation at death. The soul was the real person. The body was an obstacle. For Aristotle, the soul is the form of the body, not a separate substance related externally to the body, but the organizing principle that makes the body a living body rather than a dead one. The relationship between soul and body, he says explicitly, is like the relationship between the shape of a wax seal and the wax. You cannot have the shape of the seal without some wax or other material to be shaped, and the shape is not a thing separate from the shaped material, but the material's way of being organized. Similarly, the soul is not a thing separate from the body, but the body's way of being organized as a living thing. Aristotle states the implication directly and clearly. It is not necessary to ask whether the soul and body are one, any more than it is necessary to ask whether the wax and its shape are one. The question does not arise. Soul and body are one substance, viewed from two different perspectives, the material perspective of what it is made of and the formal perspective of how it is organized. This means that the soul does not survive the body's death in any straightforward sense. The soul is the body's being alive. When the body dies, the soul ends, in the same way that the shape of a wax seal ends when the wax is melted down. Not by going somewhere else, but by ceasing to be the organizing principle of the material that constituted the living organism. This is a naturalistic, biological account of soul, entirely continuous with his biological investigations. The soul is what makes animals alive, and studying the soul is studying what life is and how it works. Aristotle distinguished three kinds of soul, or three levels of soul's capacities. The nutritive soul is the most basic. It includes the capacities for self-nourishment, growth, and reproduction, the minimal conditions for being alive, and it is shared by all living things, including plants. The sensitive soul adds the capacities for perception, imagination, and desire, for being in sensory contact with the environment and being moved by what is perceived. It is characteristic of animals. The rational soul adds the capacities for thought and reasoning, for grasping universals and deliberating about action. It is specific to human beings and perhaps to divine beings. Perception, in Aristotle's account, is the reception of the form of an object without its matter. When you see a red apple, your eye takes on the redness of the apple, becomes formally like the apple in respect of color, without becoming materially red, without the red material of the apple entering the eye. The sense organ is affected in a formal but not a material way by the object perceived. This is a subtle, and in some ways surprisingly modern-sounding account. It emphasizes the informational or formal character of perception rather than the material transaction. Contemporary cognitive scientists who think of perception as the brain taking on representational states that mirror features of the external world are working in a tradition that has some connection to this Aristotelian idea. The one major puzzle in Aristotle's psychology is the active intellect, a mysterious element introduced in a dense and notoriously difficult passage of the De Anima. Among the capacities of the rational soul, Aristotle seems to distinguish an active element, which actualizes thinking, from a passive element, which receives intelligible forms when thinking occurs. And the active intellect, he says, is separable from the body, unmixed with matter, and immortal and eternal. This is a startling claim in the context of an account that has otherwise thoroughly embedded the soul in the body, and it generated centuries of commentary and controversy. Is the active intellect the individual's own, or something shared or divine? Does it survive individual death? Does Aristotle think personal immortality is possible after all? The passage is too compressed and too elliptical to answer these questions definitively, and scholars have not reached consensus in 2,500 years. Ethics, the good life, virtue, and practical wisdom. Aristotle's ethics, presented in the Nicomachean Ethics and the somewhat different Eudemian Ethics, is one of the most influential and most discussed accounts of how human beings ought to live in the entire philosophical tradition, and it has experienced a remarkable philosophical revival over the last 50 years as virtue ethics has re-emerged as a major alternative to utilitarian and Kantian approaches. He begins with an observation so simple it almost seems trivial, but which turns out to have significant philosophical weight. Everything we do for some end or goal. We go to the doctor for our health. We want health so that we can live well. We want to live well because that is good. But this chain of means and ends must stop somewhere. There must be something that is good in itself, not merely as a means to something further, or there is no reason to do anything at all. Everything would be instrumental to something else in an infinite regress. There must be an ultimate end, a final good, something worth pursuing for its own sake. Aristotle calls this ultimate end eudaimonia, which is traditionally translated as happiness, but which much better rendered as flourishing, or living well, or the good life. Eudaimonia is not a feeling or an experience. It is a way of living, an activity, a condition of a life that is going well in the way a human life should go. And to know what that means, we need to know what human beings are, what is distinctive and characteristic about human life. His answer, the distinctive feature of human beings is rational activity, the exercise of the soul's capacities in a way that involves reason. Plants live, but their living does not involve reason. Animals perceive and desire, but their perceiving and desiring are not, for the most part, guided by reason. Human beings can reason, can deliberate, can act on the basis of reflection rather than mere impulse. The good life for a human being is therefore the life lived in excellent exercise of rational activity, in accordance with virtue, and over a complete life. The moral virtues, courage, justice, temperance, generosity, magnificence, proper ambition, good temper, truthfulness, wit, friendliness, and the others, are stable dispositions of character that make one reliably inclined to feel the right emotions and make the right choices in the relevant domain. They are not rules to follow, but deeply embedded habits of feeling and action that have become second nature through long practice. The virtuous person does not merely do the right thing. They feel the right way about doing it, take pleasure in doing it, would be uncomfortable not doing it. The continent person who does the right thing while feeling the pull of contrary inclinations is better than the incontinent person who does the wrong thing, but is not yet fully virtuous. Full virtue involves the integration of emotion, desire, and rational choice. The doctrine of the mean, the most famous element of Aristotle's account of the moral virtues, holds that each virtue is an appropriate or fitting response to its relevant domain, lying between two extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage lies between cowardice, which responds with too much fear and too little confidence in dangerous situations, and recklessness, which responds with too little fear and too much confidence. Generosity lies between miserliness and prodigality. Good temper lies between irascibility and a kind of spineless incapacity to feel appropriate anger. The doctrine of the mean is not a formula for calculating the midpoint between two extreme quantities. The right amount, the appropriate response, is relative to the person and the situation and many other factors, and perceiving what is appropriate in any particular situation requires judgment rather than calculation. This is the function of practical wisdom, phronses, which Aristotle treats as the master virtue of the ethical domain, the stable disposition to perceive what a situation requires, to deliberate well about how to achieve good ends, and to act on that deliberation. Practical wisdom is not knowledge of universal rules, but judgment about particulars, developed through experience and reflection over time. It cannot be learned from a book. It can only be developed through living. Aristotle's account of happiness requires external goods as well as virtuous activity, and this requirement is philosophically significant. A person who is genuinely virtuous but who is deeply impoverished, friendless, physically disabled, or struck repeatedly by serious misfortune does not have the good life, even if they bear their misfortune with perfect equanimity. The Stoics would later argue that virtue alone is sufficient for happiness, that all external goods are indifferent, and that the sage is happy even on the rack. Aristotle thinks this is heroic nonsense. A human life is not a purely interior state that can flourish regardless of external conditions. We are embodied social creatures, and the full exercise of our capacities requires adequate material conditions, genuine friendship, and a reasonable degree of good fortune. This is being realistic about what a human life actually is. Friendship, the ethical core that philosophy has neglected. The Nicomachean Ethics devotes 2 of its 10 books to friendship, philia, a proportion that immediately signals how important Aristotle thought it was to the good life. This level of attention to friendship in an ethical treatise is unusual, and the analytical depth and human insight Aristotle brings to the topic is part of what has made his account of friendship the most influential in the Western philosophical tradition, even if the broader philosophical tradition has largely ignored his example and treated friendship as outside the proper scope of moral philosophy. Aristotle distinguished 3 kinds of friendship organized by what is valued in the relationship. Utility friendships. People are friends because of the practical benefit they get from each other, because each has something useful to offer the other. Pleasure friendships. People are friends because they enjoy each other's company, find each other amusing or interesting or entertaining, take pleasure in the association. Virtue friendships. People are friends because of each other's character, because they love each other as the people they genuinely are, because what each finds valuable in the other is something stable and deep. The first 2 kinds are real friendships, not mere pretense, but they are contingent and easily dissolved. When the utility ends, the utility friendship ends. When the taste changes or the pleasure fades, the pleasure friendship ends. Neither kind is based on what is stable in the other person, so neither kind is stable itself. Virtue friendship is different. It is based on the character of each person, which is stable, and it therefore tends to be stable itself. It also tends to be mutually beneficial and mutually pleasurable, because good people are useful to each other in the most important ways and enjoy each other's company. But these are consequences of the friendship rather than its basis. Virtue friendship requires that both parties be people of genuinely good character, and this has an interesting consequence. It requires that you be a person of good character yourself to have a virtue friendship, because you cannot recognize and appreciate another person's character without having the character that allows you to perceive it correctly. You cannot love someone for their genuine goodness if you do not yourself understand what goodness is. Virtue friendship is therefore self-limiting. It is available only to people who have done the work of developing genuine virtue, which is not most people in most places most of the time. This makes it rare and slow to develop, but extremely valuable when it exists. The famous formula that a friend is another self, heteros autos, captures something of what Aristotle means by the highest friendship. The friend is not literally another person identical to oneself, but someone known so well and loved so genuinely that their good is experienced as one's own good, their suffering as one's own suffering, their flourishing as one's own flourishing. This is not the loss of self in the other, but a kind of expansion. The truly good friend extends the scope of what matters to you, gives you more people whose well-being is genuinely your concern and whose perspective genuinely enriches your understanding. Aristotle makes the further claim that having genuine friends is not merely pleasant or instrumentally useful, but is itself a component of the good life, something without which a human life cannot fully flourish. The person who has every virtue but no friends is missing something essential, not because friends are useful for getting other things, but because the full exercise of human capacities, including the highest ones, is social. The thinker who thinks alone is impoverished compared to the thinker who thinks in genuine exchange with a good mind. The person who acts virtuously in isolation is doing something real, but something less complete than what is possible in a genuine community of good people who understand and appreciate what virtue requires. Politics, the science of the city. Aristotle's Politics is one of the foundational texts of political philosophy, and its method is as characteristic of Aristotle as anything he wrote. Empirical, comparative, realistic about human nature, oriented toward what is achievable rather than what is ideal, and producing conclusions that are neither simple endorsements of existing practice nor utopian blueprints for perfect societies. He begins from the claim that the human being is by nature a political animal, a creature of the polis, the city-state. This is not merely a sociological observation, but a philosophical claim about human nature. Human beings are constituted in such a way that they can only fully flourish in a political community of a certain kind, large and complex, enough to allow for the full development of distinctively human capacities, governed by law and oriented toward the common good. The person who can live outside any community is either less than human, an animal sufficient to itself in the way animals are, or more than human, a god sufficient to itself in the way the divine is. A human being needs the polis the way a hand needs a body. Rather than constructing an ideal city from first principles, as Plato did in the Republic, Aristotle collected and analyzed the constitutions of more than 150 actual Greek city-states, a monumental empirical project of which only the Constitution of Athens survives. This collection formed the basis for his political science, a discipline that studied actual political systems with empirical rigor, not to describe them without evaluation, but to understand what conditions made them succeed or fail at the goal of promoting human flourishing. His taxonomy of constitutions is famous: 3 correct forms and 3 deviations, organized by how many people govern and whether they govern for the common good or for private benefit. Monarchy is rule by one person in the common interest. Tyranny is rule by one for private gain. Aristocracy is rule by the few, the best qualified in the common interest. Oligarchy is rule by the few, typically the wealthy, for their own benefit. Polity is rule by the many in the common interest. Democracy in Aristotle's technical sense is rule by the many, typically the poor, for their own benefit. Among these forms, Aristotle prefers polity, a mixed constitution that combines elements of oligarchy and democracy, giving roles to both the wealthy and the many ordinary citizens, and tending toward a large and stable middle class. The middle class is politically crucial because it is moderate, wealthy enough to have a genuine stake in the stability and prosperity of the community, not wealthy enough to have ambitions of domination, not poor enough to be desperate and resentful and easily led by demagogues. A city dominated by the middle class is the most stable and most just city that actual human beings, with their actual characters and actual circumstances, can sustain. His attitude toward democracy is more nuanced than Plato's. He makes a genuinely interesting argument for democratic participation. The collective judgment of many people who each know something relevant can exceed the judgment of any single individual, even the wisest, in the way that a feast to which many contributors each bring something is better than one provided by a single person. This anticipates some themes in modern democratic theory about the epistemic value of collective decision-making. But he also thought democracy had characteristic pathologies, particularly the tendency toward demagogy, and that democracy worked better or worse, depending on the character and economic circumstances of the citizens. His political theory assumed slavery and the subordination of women, defended through claims about natural differences in rational capacity that are false. These aspects of his politics have been rightly criticized and have been used for terrible purposes by people who invoked Aristotle's authority to defend institutions that are indefensible. The framework he developed for thinking about political life was excellent. Some of the specific conclusions he drew within that framework were wrong in ways that reflect the limitations of his time, culture, and the false empirical assumptions he brought to questions about human natural differences. Rhetoric and poetics, understanding how language works. The rhetoric and the poetics are works that fall somewhat outside the categories of natural philosophy and ethics and politics, and they show Aristotle applying his characteristic analytical method to the arts of language in ways that have been foundational for the disciplines of rhetoric and literary criticism. The rhetoric is not a handbook for orators, but a philosophical investigation of how language persuades and what the proper and improper forms of persuasion are. Aristotle identified three modes of persuasion available to speakers: logos, the appeal through argument and reasoning; ethos, the appeal through the character and credibility of the speaker; and pathos, the appeal through the emotions of the audience. All three, he argued, were legitimate means of persuasion when properly used. A speaker who argues well, who has established genuine credibility through evident good character and relevant expertise, and who moves the audience to appropriate emotions that fit the subject. This speaker is practicing rhetoric rightly. The speaker who manipulates, who makes the weaker argument appear stronger through illegitimate emotional manipulation, is the sophist. The analysis of emotions in the rhetoric is one of the first systematic treatments of emotional psychology in Western literature. Aristotle analyzed anger and what causes it and what relieves it, shame and its objects, fear and pity, and what kinds of things typically arouse them, indignation and envy and their conditions, the emotions that lead people to feel confident or to feel frightened. These analyses are psychologically sophisticated and have been drawn on by rhetoricians, playwrights, psychologists, and philosophers of emotion ever since. The Poetics is the founding document of literary criticism in the Western tradition. It analyzes tragedy with the same formal care Aristotle brought to logic and biology, defining tragedy as the imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language that is pleasurable in appropriate ways, presented through persons acting rather than through narration, and achieving through pity and fear the catharsis of these emotions. The concept of catharsis has generated more commentary than almost any other concept in aesthetics. Does tragedy purge the emotions of pity and fear, releasing the audience from excessive emotional accumulation? Does it clarify them, giving the audience a proper understanding of what is truly pitiable and truly fearful? Does it train the emotions, habituating the audience to appropriate emotional responses? Aristotle does not explain clearly, and the controversy has continued for 2,500 years. But the basic observation that tragedy works by arousing specific emotions and doing something productive with them, something that leaves the audience not simply depleted, but somehow enriched by having felt deeply, has been confirmed by every serious subsequent theory of tragic art. His account of what makes tragedy work identified plot as the soul of tragedy, the most important element, more important than character, spectacle, or language, because it is through the plot that tragedy achieves its characteristic effect on the audience. The best tragic plots involve reversal and recognition, the sudden change of fortune from good to bad, and the protagonist's recognition of what has happened and why. The best tragic heroes are people of stature and goodness who fall through some error of judgment or limitation of knowledge, hamartia, making their suffering feel both undeserved and comprehensible, producing pity at the injustice and fear the reminder of human vulnerability. The Oedipus of Sophocles remained for Aristotle the exemplary tragedy, and his analysis of why it worked has influenced the production and the criticism of drama continuously since his time. What he got wrong and why it matters. Aristotle got many important things wrong, and intellectual honesty requires spending some time on this before reaching the assessment of what he got right. His physics was wrong in ways that mattered enormously. His account of the elements, earth, water, fire, and air, each with its natural place and its natural motion, was qualitative and teleological in a way that resisted mathematization and resisted experimental test. His claim that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, which seems intuitively plausible but is false, was not definitively refuted until Galileo's experiments and theoretical work in the early 17th century. His account of projectile motion, in which a projectile is kept moving by the air that rushes in behind it, is wrong in ways that the modern concept of inertia corrects. His cosmos, organized into concentric spheres with the Earth at the center, and the stars and planets moving in perfect circles on their respective spheres, was the model that Copernicus, Galileo, and Newton replaced with the heliocentric mathematical physics that made the modern world possible. His biology, for all its genuine achievements, contained significant errors. The belief in spontaneous generation was not definitively refuted until Pasteur's experiments in the 19th century. The attribution of intelligence to the heart rather than the brain was wrong. The claim that women have fewer teeth than men was simply careless, and his theoretical biology, organized around teleological principles and substantial forms, was replaced by a mechanistic and then an evolutionary biology that explained the apparent purposiveness of living things without appeal to inherent purposes. His political philosophy, as noted, assumed and defended slavery and the subordination of women through false claims about natural differences in rational capacity. His argument for natural slavery, that some human beings are by nature fit only to be governed, has been rightly rejected and has been used to defend institutions of terrible injustice by people who invoked his authority. The framework was excellent. These specific applications of it were wrong. Understanding where Aristotle went wrong is important not to diminish him, but to understand what kind of achievement his work represents. He was wrong in specific ways, ways that can be identified and corrected. He was not systematically wrong in method. His physics was wrong partly because he did not use mathematics to describe natural phenomena, which turned out to be the key to physics, and partly because he did not conduct the controlled experiments that would have revealed where his intuitions were mistaken. His biology was mostly right where he actually went, and looked and wrong where he relied on assumption or common belief. The lesson is clear. Careful empirical observation is more reliable than intuitive a priori reasoning about what nature must be like. The medieval Aristotle, the philosopher. After the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, most of Aristotle's works were lost to Western Europe. They survived in the Islamic world, where from the 8th century onwards scholars translated them from Greek into Arabic and developed a sophisticated tradition of Aristotelian commentary and original philosophical work. Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, and most importantly Averroes, whose commentaries on Aristotle were so thorough and so respected that he became known simply as the commentator, developed and transmitted the Aristotelian tradition in ways that would eventually transform European intellectual life. In the 12th and 13th centuries, Aristotle's works were translated from Arabic into Latin and arrived in Western Europe with the force of a revelation. Here was a comprehensive system of knowledge about the natural world and about human nature and about the principles of valid reasoning, worked out with extraordinary rigor by a single intellect, largely independent of Christian theology. The universities of Western Europe, just being founded in this period, organized their curricula substantially around the study of Aristotle. He became simply the philosopher, no other qualification needed. The project of reconciling Aristotle with Christian theology was the central intellectual work of the high medieval period. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of the scholastic theologians, devoted decades to this project, using Aristotelian metaphysics, logic, and natural philosophy to articulate and defend Christian doctrine. The unmoved mover became the god of Christian theology. The doctrine of substance and form became the metaphysical framework for the doctrine of transubstantiation. The four causes were applied to the theology of creation. The natural teleology of Aristotle's physics and biology was read as evidence for divine design. The result was Thomism, the philosophical theology that remains the official philosophy of the Catholic Church. This canonization had costs. Aristotle was so thoroughly absorbed into the intellectual establishment that to question Aristotle was to question not just a philosopher, but the entire framework of medieval learning, backed by the authority of the Church and the universities. When Galileo argued against the Aristotelian physics and the Aristotelian cosmos, he was not merely proposing a different scientific theory. He was challenging an entire way of organizing knowledge and authority, and the challenge was dangerous in exactly the ways that challenges to authority are dangerous. The scientific revolution was not only an intellectual achievement, but a political struggle, and the authority being struggled against was largely Aristotelian. The enduring achievements, what Aristotle got right. Having spent time on what Aristotle got wrong, it is important to be equally clear about what he got right, because the scale of what he got right and the enduring quality of it is part of what makes him one of the most significant thinkers in human history. He was right that knowledge comes in different kinds, requiring different methods. The kind of rigor appropriate to formal logic is not the same as the kind appropriate to ethics or politics or literary criticism. Trying to impose mathematical precision on domains where it does not fit, or empirical investigation on domains that are conceptual, produces false certainty rather than genuine understanding. This is a methodological insight that has had to be defended and re-argued in every generation, because every generation produces thinkers who are impressed by the success of one method in one domain and want to apply it everywhere. He was right that the particular matters and cannot be bypassed. His insistence on studying actual constitutions rather than ideal ones, actual species rather than ideal forms, actual human situations rather than abstract principles, produced his best work and anticipated the empirical method that made modern science possible. The universals are real and important, but they exist in the particulars and cannot be understood except through careful attention to the particulars. He was right about virtue as a stable disposition of character developed through practice. The insight that we become what we repeatedly do, that character is formed by habit, that moral education is primarily a matter of guiding the young person to act and feel well until good acting and feeling become second nature. This is confirmed by everything we know about psychological development. People do not become courageous by resolving to be courageous. They become courageous by doing courageous things repeatedly until courage becomes their natural response. He was right about the doctrine of the mean as a general model for moral psychology. The idea that virtuous behavior and feeling is appropriate, fitting, neither excessive nor deficient, and that what is appropriate varies with the situation and the person and cannot be captured in a simple universal rule, is a more realistic account of moral life than most alternatives. The contemporary revival of virtue ethics has drawn extensively on Aristotle, precisely because his account is more psychologically accurate than the rule-based alternatives. He was right about friendship as a central component of the good life, not merely a pleasant addition to it. The philosophical tradition largely ignored this, treating morality as primarily about obligations among strangers or about maximizing welfare in the aggregate. Aristotle's insistence that the deepest and most important kind of friendship was constitutive of human flourishing, something without which even a very virtuous person would be missing something essential, has been recognized by virtue ethicists as an important corrective to the impersonalism of much modern moral philosophy. And in biology, his combination of patient observation, systematic classification, and functional explanation, asking not just what things are but what they are for, was genuinely productive in a way that his physics was not. The spirit of the biological method anticipated modern scientific practice in ways that his physics did not, and Charles Darwin's tribute stands. Sitting with Aristotle in the late night. It is very late now, and we have covered a great deal of ground. We have been through logic and metaphysics, and the philosophy of nature, and the soul and biology, and ethics, and friendship, and politics, and rhetoric and poetics, moving through something like the full range of what one mind tried to hold and systematize in the 4th century before the Common Era. We have not touched everything. The Meteorologica, the works on memory and sleep and dreams, the work on breathing and on length and shortness of life, the philosophical theology in the most technical passages of the metaphysics. What I find most affecting about Aristotle, and I want to end here, is not any particular doctrine, but the quality of attention that runs through everything he wrote, even the dense and difficult passages that resist easy reading. It is the attention of someone who genuinely finds the world interesting enough to examine carefully, who trusts that the world makes sense and that patient inquiry will reveal the sense it makes, who believes that the work of understanding is one of the most worthwhile things a human being can do. He looked at the embryo developing inside the fertilized egg, at different stages of incubation, and wanted to understand what was happening and why. He looked at the social organization of bees and wanted to know how it worked and what the functional principles behind it were. He looked at the structure of the nautilus's shell and wanted to understand its purpose. He looked at the emotions that tragedy produced in audiences and wanted to know why those particular emotions and what they were doing there. He looked at friendship across its many forms and wanted to understand what distinguished the deep ones from the shallow ones and what the deep ones were for. He looked at political systems rising and falling and wanted to understand what conditions made them stable or unstable, just or unjust, capable of promoting human flourishing or systematically destructive of it. All of this looking was organized by a single conviction, that the world had a structure that careful inquiry could reveal, that things had natures that could be understood, that the work of understanding was never wasted even when specific conclusions were wrong. This conviction proved extremely productive in biology and in ethics and in logic. It proved less productive in physics, where the structure of the world turned out to require mathematical description rather than the qualitative analysis he offered. But the conviction itself, that the world makes sense and can be understood, is foundational to all scientific and philosophical inquiry. He died at 62 in Chalcis, having left Athens rather than give it the opportunity to sin against philosophy a second time. He left a school that continued his work. He left the texts, which survived the accidents of time and transmission to arrive in our hands 2,500 years later, still generating commentary and argument and new understanding. He left a way of approaching the world, with curiosity, with patience, with the willingness to look carefully and think carefully and revise when the evidence requires, with the conviction that understanding is worth the effort. The question he asked about everything he encountered, what is this thing? What is it made of? How does it work? And what is it for? It is still a good question. It is still worth asking every day about whatever happens to be in front of you. Sleep well. Thank you for thinking with me tonight.